Sister Kelly, can you say something into the mic?
So good morning to everyone.
Okay.
We'll give everyone a chance to get situated, and then we're going to be starting our lesson. The next several lessons are on David and Solomon.
Praise you, Jesus. Praise you, Jesus. Praise you, Jesus.
And those of you that were here last week know that the lesson taught last week was on David's early years, and the lesson today is on David's fugitive years. And before we get started, kind of a little backdrop here, an introduction if you would, that how many know that in recent years GPS-equipped navigation devices have become quite common? Whether walking or driving, theoretically one never need get lost because you have this friendly computer-generated voice guiding your every turn.
Yes.
And of course, if you're traveling and you do make a wrong turn, this gadget becomes even more valuable because within moments, what does the voice do? It offers reassurance that it is recalculating, and soon there's a new route to the destination in place, and you're good to go.
Amen.
And
Hallelujah.
that moment of apprehension over a wrong turn is all of a sudden alleviated because you have the insurance that you're on the right path again thanks to this friendly little guidance.
Hallelujah.
And most Christians find great joy in knowing that God has a plan for their lives.
Amen.
And their great joy and sense of purpose can be clouded with the realization that they've made a terrible mistake or embarked upon a series of bad decisions that have taken them far from what God's original plans were. And there may be even some of us here today that struggle with that. But there's great comfort to be found in the knowledge that in spite of our failures and our shortcomings, God's will is never thwarted.
Praise God.
And when we turn to Him, He can completely restore us to the purpose that He has for us.
Yes.
During the next 8 weeks, we're going to explore. It'll actually be 7 weeks because I wasn't here last week. But the next 7 weeks, we're going to explore the biblical accounts of two men who experienced this in profound ways. If I say the names of David and Solomon, you're going to easily recognize them as central characters in Scripture, as would most believers. David was in the natural God's unlikely choice to be king. He was a person of faith. He had tenacity. He was well established even in his younger years. He slew a giant. He fled the murderous intentions of Saul. He ascended to Israel's throne. He led the nation to great victory. Yet he also fell to the temptation of sins that some Christians could scarcely imagine. However, in the end, David is remembered simply as a man after God's own heart.
Hallelujah.
And Israel enjoyed God's blessings.
Amen.
And then some of our lessons are also going to be about Solomon. Solomon, too, he enjoyed the Lord's blessings in the form of wisdom and riches beyond everyday comprehension. He built a temple for the Lord. It stood as a testimony to the nations. It's considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. Yet, still Solomon later became so entangled in unwise and sinful marriages with pagan women, yet God's blessing and his plan for his people Israel ultimately endured even under Solomon.
Praise.
And so, as we go through this unit, if you're struggling with sins of the past, David can be a great reminder of God's forgiveness and God's plan for his people ultimately coming to pass in ways that are beyond our imagination. So that being said, let's go ahead and get into the scriptures. We'll start in 1 Samuel chapter 18, if anyone wants to turn there. But our key verse is 1 Samuel 18:14. David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. And our determination to answer the Lord's call and to fulfill his plan for our lives will at times be tested. And the tests can at times be in the form of very significant adversity. And such severe challenges can at times make people question the Lord at critical moments. But David here has provided a clear example of the way adversity may manifest itself, as well as the challenge of dealing with adversity in a manner that truly pleases God. And this week's lesson is to help us consider the possible difficulties we're facing and then ask the Lord to grant insight and choices in the help of these trying circumstances. So all that being said, we'll read in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. And it came to pass that when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house. And then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David and his garments, even his sword and his bow and his girdle. So we have here Jonathan, the son of the king, the son of King Saul, and he provides to me what is one of the greatest examples of friendship you'll ever read or you'll ever see. When his own father was determined to treat David unjustly, which those that were here last week, that was part of your lesson, Jonathan was an advocate for David, and Jonathan protected him from harm. Jonathan recognized that the Lord was with David, and Jonathan, unlike his father, was smart enough to know that Israel's success was directly linked to his friend David and David's survival. And God used Jonathan to bring comfort to David during some of the most difficult times in David's life. And we read in verse 1 where the Bible declares that the Lord knit the spirits of the two men together. And as a result, Jonathan made a covenant with David and gave him gifts. And these gifts were very significant because these gifts included his robe, his tunic, his sword, and bow as a seal of this great bond between them. And just to reiterate, you already know this, but Jonathan was a prince. He was the heir apparent. He was the son of the king. And he stripped himself of his royal armor, his insignia, his weapons, and he gave all this to David. And by him doing that, Jonathan was demonstrating David was admired. He was uniquely valued by Jonathan. This was not just your average run-of-the-mill friend. This was something much, much deeper and much greater. And it even says he transferred his robe to David. Basically what Jonathan was doing was equal to a transfer of status and a transfer of position. Jonathan was acknowledging that in God's eyes, David would be king, not himself. And this friendship was so strong, it literally lasted a lifetime until one of the two parties died. And, you know, when Saul's hostilities increased to the point of trying to take David's life, Jonathan advocated for his friend and he sought to alleviate his father's anger. And on one occasion, it appeared as though he had succeeded, because after warning David of Saul's malicious intentions, we read this in chapter 19, Jonathan convinced Saul of David's value and David's loyalty to the throne, and even to the point that David was able to temporarily return to the palace and to Saul's service. I have a question if anyone would like to comment on it. How are Jonathan's actions a good model for our own friendships? Any thoughts from anyone?
Well, the scripture tells us to esteem another better than ourselves, I know.
Okay, anyone else?
When we give honor, it says to esteem those highly that are over you in the Lord.
Okay. Well, we should never underestimate the value of a strong, committed friendship and what value that can bring to our life. It's very important to learn how to seek out trustworthy, godly people for help.
Amen.
We have to also be willing to offer our friendship to others if they're going through difficult times. But how many know who we choose as friends and the kind of friends we choose will affect us in our life? And so we need to be careful with that. Any thoughts from anyone before we continue? Okay, so let's read a few more here about what Jonathan did. Let's turn over to chapter 20 and verse 30. I'll give you a moment if you have your Bible and want to turn there. Chapter 20 and verses 30 through 34. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion, and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father and said unto him, Wherefore shall he be slain? What has he done? And Saul cast a javelin at his own son to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David. And so Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger, and did eat no meat the 2nd day of the month. He was grieved for David because his father had done him shame. So we see here where where Jonathan's devotion to David eventually required some significant sacrifice. And we read as time progressed that Saul's paranoias, Saul's jealousy, and Saul's hatred grew. And he became increasingly determined to destroy his adversary. And ultimately, the conflict reached a point where Jonathan was risking his own life to help protect David. And on one occasion, David was afraid to attend an important festival, which is what we just read here in chapter 20. But David was afraid to attend an important festival, and because his absence was conspicuous to Saul, Jonathan made an excuse to his father, saying, "Oh, David's taking part in a family sacrifice." And what we read starting in verse 30 was Saul was responding with raging anger. He accused his own son of treachery. And this verse indicates, Saul was directing this vile spewing even at his own son. And Saul obviously felt extremely threatened by Jonathan's deep friendship with David, and he recognized that Jonathan had sided with David. And so in response, Saul told Jonathan that as long as David survived, Jonathan was never going to be heir to the kingdom. And Saul was actually very right and accurate in that statement, because that was the plan of God. David was to be the next king. But Saul wanted to avoid the ascension of David to the throne at any cost. And Jonathan's response, which isn't surprising at all, was to ask, why should David be put to death? And then at this point, we read the story where Saul just had so much hatred and paranoia in him that what did he do? He took his spear and hurled it at Jonathan, his own son. And it was an outburst that only punctuated the clear reality that Jonathan could not escape from. And that reality was that Saul wanted David dead. Period. The end. And it was a realization that affected Jonathan so much that he was unable to eat. It literally affected him physically. And the remainder of chapter 30 to read on your own time, but it describes how Jonathan confirmed his commitment and his friendship with David. Anyone have any thoughts or comments you'd like to make as to why Jonathan took such personal risks to help David?
You would think that Jonathan himself, remember, didn't Jonathan take his armor bearer or someone, Saul instructed them not to eat before going out to battle, and all of the men were very hungry and everything, and Jonathan disobeyed his father, because his father said, you can't have anything to eat. So you would think that maybe Jonathan had a mind from God, a mindset from God, to be the way he was, and to be so protective of David that way.
Okay.
I don't know if that's right, but.
No, there's no right or wrong comments. I just like to hear people's thoughts. But have you ever had a friendship that you were willing to do a personal risk to help that person out? And so David and Jonathan loved each other. It was, such a deep, soul-felt connection. It was pretty amazing to have anyone that is blessed to have a friend like that. It doesn't happen very often.
Amen.
So that was
Amen.
really nice.
Yes.
So then we're going to read now in 1 Samuel again. We're going to skip around a couple of verses out of chapter 21 and a couple of verses out of chapter 22. 21:7 says, "Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg, an Edomite, and he was the chiefest of the herdsmen that belonged to Saul." And then if we read in chapter 22, verse 9, "Then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him victuals, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." And verse 16, "The king said, Thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house." So we see here again Saul's paranoia, jealousy, and hatred, and what it's going to cause. But for the sake of time, I didn't read all of chapter 21, but basically the setting of this passage is that David, of course, is on the run from King Saul. And you probably all know this, but in reality, David was a fugitive for the rest of Saul's life. It was an ongoing. David, however, gained great support from others who knew he was God's anointed. And so on one occasion, David went to Ahimelech, the priest of Nob. And when you read the story, Ahimelech was unaware that David was actually fleeing the king. The priest, he was unaware that David was fleeing from King Saul. And David assured the priest that his men were ceremonial clean. And then Ahimelech gives David some of the consecrated bread for his men to eat. And the priest also gave him the sword of Goliath that had been kept in the sanctuary. But there was an Edomite there named Doeg, who was Saul's head shepherd, who happened to witness this event. And he was still loyal to Saul. So Saul soon discovered, thanks to the spy, unintentional but nonetheless, where David was, and he went after him. And so when Saul arrives at Nob, he irrationally accused Ahimelech of conspiring against him by aiding his adversary. And keep in mind, Ahimelech truly did not know that Saul and David were in conflict. He was a priest. He was doing his job. And Doeg then told the king what he had witnessed, that Ahimelech helped David, and it enraged Saul so much that someone dare help David that he commanded his guards to slay Ahimelech as well as the rest of the priests. Well, the guards, when you read the story, the royal guards, they hesitated, understandably, because they were not going to be a part of killing the priests of the Lord. They were not that stupid. But Doeg, who sought Saul's favor, slaughtered them all before the king. 85 priests, plus all the men, women, children, and livestock of Nob were all killed. It was an unnecessary slaughter and attack by their own king. And this horrific story tells us, a lot about Saul. And the slaughter of the priests of Nob was a terrible tragedy. And it actually highlights a sharp contrast between Saul and David. Because on one hand, we see a rejected king acting in hate-filled contempt for a priesthood that he is determined has somehow conspired against him. And then on the other hand is a true king, David, displaying respect and displaying reverence for the priesthood, and by extension, the way of the Lord. And so in verses 20 through 23, we see the lone survivor of this massacre. It was Ahimelech's son, Abiathar, and he rushes to join David. And it's interesting to note that Abiathar performed priestly duties for David pretty much for the rest of David's life. At this point, however, they were also partners in fleeing from Saul's murderous intentions. Any thoughts or comments from anyone?
Such severe destruction in the offing, just the saints of God kind of gather together when there's a great time of persecution.
Mm-hmm.
And they stand against the evil. And boy, they really had to here, because it was a constant thing for David. But many joined David in the caves, and they were supporting him on God's side.
Mm-hmm. So let's skip over to Psalm 52. This is the Psalm of David that he wrote when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul that David had come to the house of Ahimelech and what happened. So Psalm 52 says, "Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Thy tongue deviseth mischief like a sharp razor working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, lying rather than to speak righteousness. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place and root thee out of the land of the living. The righteous also shall see him and fear and laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. And I will praise thee forever, because thou hast done it. And I will wait on thy name. It is good. So, David responded here to this senseless slaughter of the innocent victims of Saul's madness and Doeg's treachery. And this psalm is a lament, and the lament is not directed at God, but rather the evil man the psalmist refers to. Now, whether the evil man he's referring to is Doeg or Saul, we don't know. But their desires were entirely distorted, seeking out what God is against. And, David resolved to trust that God would bring the guilty parties to justice. And rather than take vengeance himself, David knew that the Lord would ultimately judge Doeg and Saul and all who are ruthless and evil. And David recognized that God was worthy of his trust, and God's just nature would ultimately ensure their doom. And David concluded this psalm with praise to God, proclaiming his trust in God's steadfastness, his unfailing love. He had been wronged, and he was in fact still quite endangered by Saul. And there was likely a strong temptation to ensure justice by, you harming the rebellious king. But David instead, he affirmed his trust in the Lord. And we can share this confidence when we're trusted with injustice, even in our own lives. And so David here, as this man after God's own heart, he instinctively understood how to respond to evil. And God was instructing David, good morning, and developing his character. And this education would have been of great benefit to David as he later reigned over the nation. And so, a couple of things to finish up here. Choosing honor over ambition. And we can read in 1 Samuel 24 and 1 Samuel 26, and they record two incidents where David resisted the opportunity to take Saul's life. So even as the king himself was continuing this vengeful pursuit of David, when we study it out, the first occurred about 2 years after David's initial flight from Saul. And the king was accompanied by 3,000 soldiers, and they were closing in. And this opportunity arose in which Saul sought to relieve himself in the very cave occupied by David. And David had ample reason in the natural to strike out at the king, both for his safety as well as the safety of the 600 men that were with him. And his men took it as a provincial opportunity given by the Lord to strike Saul and be done with it. But David, of course, had a much different view. He chose restraint. And verses 4 through 8 tell us that David not only resisted harming Saul, but he then felt guilty for what he felt was dishonoring him for cutting off part of his robe. And David still had such loyalty to Saul that he even bowed to the king and affirmed his loyalty to him after this opportunity for vengeance had passed. And more importantly, though, it lets us know that David was loyal to God. And because he still considered Saul to be the Lord's anointed, he wasn't going to harm him. And there were clearly risks on David's part, both for himself and his men, because the well-being of the men was linked directly to David. He was responsible for them and their families. And as long as Saul lived, they were all going to be in danger. They were all going to be fugitives. Their families were still going to be endangered. And how many know that honoring God in difficult situations can hold inherent risk? And David, potentially in the natural, he could have moved the timetable of his own kingship forward if he had simply gotten rid of Saul. But he chose to honor God instead, knowing that God would fulfill the promise in his own time. And another incident in David's life we read in chapter 26. It opens with another betrayal of David, this time by the Ziphites. And Saul, and again his force of 3,000 were camped. Saul's spear was next to his head. David crept up close enough to Saul where he had the prime opportunity to bring about Saul's demise. And David again resisted. And what did he do? He took as a trophy Saul's pot and his spear. And then from a distance, he starts he taunted Abner, the commander of Saul's army, saying, hey, you allowed Saul to be exposed to harm. I could have killed him and I didn't. And so the question of our lesson is then, what do we learn from David? We learn from him an example of honor and restraint. David was more afraid of God, or I shouldn't say afraid. He had more fear for God than he was afraid of Saul. And he preferred a clear conscience to any personal desire to usurp the throne on his own rather than trusting God's timing. And it's important to us to remember that we too have to be willing to practice restraint, and that our highest calling is to honor the Lord and trust in him. And so it's 11 o'clock, so in closing up here, the kids should be in any moment. David was a wise man, and his heart was in tune with God's plan for his life. And one important aspect of his wisdom was to display this godly character of trusting the Lord instead of taking matters into his own hands. And he can serve as a great example as we serve to navigate through a complicated world, dedicating ourselves to that same path forged by David, committing to honor God not just by word but in deed, and see what he has. Any closing questions from anyone?
Well, the scripture says, the vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And I believe that when we obey the word, because the word says, touch not mine anointed and do my prophets no harm. And when we are in obedience to the Lord, then he does fight our battles, and we can't put vengeance on anyone or anything, really. We have to leave it with the Lord because he's in charge. And it's hard sometimes. It is hard. You want to strike out, and somebody does you wrong, you want to get them, but yeah.
Yes, David showed remarkable integrity in how he handled himself fleeing for his life.
Amen.
And then next week, our lesson is on David's successes as kings, and the following week it's on David's failures as king. So just to give you guys an update. Thank you.
How are you? I'm good. I rode out with some friends. Are you good? I'm so excited. There's some beautiful things we have for service. I've been doing it even or just get in contact with you guys. I pray for you all the time, and I just wonder how everything is going for you. I've got to get here for you. So thank you. Well, it's a privilege that I was just last night. You really have some see what's happening. I even asked Pastor Nancy to say, so, well, I wrote out with some friends, where did I act for so long? There's people who come in and say,
Yeah.
and so they asked me to write out with them, and then God gets Sunday night last week. It plays. The bad thing is, we have to be meeting them. Well, I've been wanting to get a hold of you so I can check. What is your phone number for you? My cell phone, I'll give it to you at 664.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? I'm glad to have you here this morning.
That's why I was wanting to spell your last name. Yeah, we can hear me and smile, so I can have that. How's your phone at?
How did I know you guys were going to be here this morning? Somehow I knew.
Doing great, doing great. I knew you guys were gonna be here.